All right, good morning, everyone. We're going over lab 6 today, which is water quality. It kind of really relates to that past lab where we are looking at water resources, but now we're looking at the quality of water that we use and that we interact with in our world. So some different water quality parameters that affect the water that we have is dissolved oxygen, how much oxygen is in our water, the temperature that it's in, and turbidity. So how cloudy is our water? And cloudiness, it depends on a lot of different things. If there's other particles or contaminants in your water, and what does that mean if we do have that for the ecosystem, but also for the water that we consume. So for today's lab, the purpose of it is to explore the relationship between dissolved oxygen and temperature, and the measurements of both will be given to us, and we're going to be making 2 graphs. And also we're going to try to understand erosion in stream water and how that affects stream water quality. So we'll simulate a storm event and sample turbidity or the cloudiness of different water samples and different particles within those water samples. But those, all the data that we need to work with will be given to us today through the Excel sheet on Canvas Lab 6 page. But our learning outcomes is to be able to describe the relationship between dissolved oxygen and temperature, explore the concept of turbidity and its relationship with soil erosion. So at the end of this, you'll be able to answer your Lab 6 assignment questions. It's on the last page, the intro on the Canvas. So under Lab 6 Canvas page, there's like the introduction, that link. At the very end, that last page, there's 5 questions, but I think also there's another link within that same page that also just puts it into one doc for you to refer to. And along with that, answering those questions, you'll turn in an Excel spreadsheet with 1 scatter plot and a bar graph, and we'll be making that together. So as a note, there's no labs next week because we have Easter holiday. So we will meet in 2 weeks, the week of April 5th. Okay. So as an introduction, I'm going to show this brief 5-minute video about dissolved oxygen. What does that look like in water systems and different ways that oxygen can be taken out or added into different water systems. So I will show you this video now.
Hey Maggie, is there supposed to be any sound with the video?
Let me try this again. I think that it's not sharing the sound. Okay.
Imagine a world where we weren't surrounded by air. Without the oxygen in the air that we breathe, we wouldn't survive very long. But what about animals underwater? They need oxygen too. Where do they get it? The answer is from the water, because water actually also contains dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen is just what it sounds like. It's oxygen that's dissolved in water. What does it mean for something to dissolve? If you've ever mixed sugar in water, you've noticed that the sugar seems to disappear. But what really happens is that the molecules of water mix with and surround the sugar molecules, breaking up the large sugar granules to make a sugar-water mixture. More specifically, since the parts of the mixture are spread out equally and evenly everywhere, we can call this mixture a solution. So when we say that something dissolves, it just means that it goes into an evenly distributed mixture called a solution. Now, like those sugar molecules, oxygen molecules also mix evenly with water molecules to form a solution. In other words, oxygen dissolves in water. But how does the oxygen get there in the first place? Well, there are 2 main ways that oxygen can enter a body of water, like the ocean or a lake. One way is from the atmosphere, or the air around us. Oxygen makes up about 1/5 of the atmosphere, and these oxygen molecules are constantly bumping into and entering water. Even more oxygen enters water through photosynthesis. You probably know photosynthesis mainly as the way that plants around us feed themselves. But there's actually a whole slew of other photosynthetic living things aside from plants. From tiny green bacteria called cyanobacteria to little phytoplankton with crazy names like dinoflagellate and even crazier bodies. All these creatures can produce food through photosynthesis. But in doing so, they actually also produce oxygen, which then dissolves in the water. What happens to this dissolved oxygen? Remember that like us other living things, the animals, plants, phytoplankton, and bacteria living underwater also take up oxygen to live. Furthermore, oxygen molecules are continually shuttling back and forth between the atmosphere and the water. But note that there's always at least some amount of oxygen that stays dissolved, and this amount depends on water conditions like the saltiness and temperature of water, and how much dissolved oxygen there is compared to the oxygen levels in the air. Now, why does the amount of oxygen already dissolved in the water and the surrounding air matter? Well, it's the same principle as walking into a crowded room from an empty hallway. You don't want to go in, and the people inside are trying to get out. In the same way, if there's more oxygen in the water than in the surrounding air, then the oxygen moves to the roomier atmosphere. Or if there's more oxygen in the air, then the oxygen moves to the water. The principle is the same for the saltiness of water. If you've ever tasted seawater, you know how salty it is, and that's because there's salt dissolved in seawater. Well, those salts are also taking up space in the water. You can imagine that as adding even more people to your crowded room, and the more people there are, the less room there is for you. So the saltier it is, the less space there is for dissolved oxygen. What about temperature? Well, when things heat up, they start moving around. Imagine yourself in a crowded room again. As everyone starts jostling around, it's a lot easier to move out of the room. Again, it's the same for dissolved oxygen. The oxygen molecules warm up and they start vibrating, making it easier for them to escape the water. So let's sum that up. Dissolved oxygen enters water from the atmosphere and from photosynthesis, and then gets taken up by living things or exits into the atmosphere depending on water temperature, saltiness, and the amount of already dissolved oxygen. Now you're probably thinking, who cares what the amount of dissolved oxygen is? Well, remember that living things need oxygen to live, and the more oxygen there is, the more animals can live there. So scientists measure dissolved oxygen to find out how healthy a body of water like a lake or a river is. But animals also adapt to the amount of dissolved oxygen. Fish like salmon need a lot of oxygen so they can only live in colder places, but fish like catfish can live in warmer waters because they need less oxygen. If you've ever wondered why the kinds of fish are different in different places, this is one reason why. Unfortunately, even these fish die off at very low oxygen levels, and humans have been decreasing freshwater oxygen levels in a process called eutrophication. Eutrophication is a big word that just means adding a lot of nutrients good for growing, like nitrogen and phosphorus, to a lake or a river, usually by pollution. That causes a lot of plants and cyanobacteria to bloom. Aren't plants good though? Don't they produce dissolved oxygen? Well, yes, but when they die, they sink to the bottom of the lake and decay there, and this decay uses up all the oxygen in the lake. With no oxygen to breathe, the fish and other animals die and the lake becomes unhealthy. So throw your trash properly and recycle. Together we can preserve our marine and freshwater ecosystems.
So that was a brief intro on a couple of topics that we're going to later cover. So along with dissolved oxygen, what does it mean as temperature changes? What does it mean as nutrients are introduced into our water bodies? But first, if we wanted to go over a little bit more about dissolved oxygen, we have aquatic animals, as I went over in like the video, such as fish, require oxygen to survive, just as air-breathing animals do. So dissolved oxygen is oxygen contained in water is termed dissolved oxygen. It's measured in milligrams per liter, and usually for a healthy amount of dissolved oxygen for the average fish to survive on. It varies, but they usually need around 5 to 6 milligrams per liter. Anything less than that, around 4 to 5, that's when they stop reproducing. Around 3 to 4, that's when they stop feeding. And then around 1, that's when they stop living. That's when they die. So dissolved oxygen, very important for fish, very important for organisms that live in water. And it is one of the most important water quality parameters. So this is something that we can directly measure. Most dissolved oxygen diffuses into water from the atmosphere. There is a small percentage that is produced by photosynthesis through whatever aquatic animals or whatever aquatic vegetation or cyanobacteria that live in your water system, but it depends on your system. It depends on what types of vegetation are present in your water body. But most of it is diffused into water through the atmosphere. So when your river or your water body, as it agitates, like say, as it moves over stones, that's how air from the atmosphere, it goes into water. So one way that we can measure dissolved oxygen is by using the HOC40 HQD dissolved oxygen meter. And this is US EPA approved method. It's very accurate, it's portable, so super field friendly. You can take it on the go. It's very easy to store and use when you're in the field. And you can do multiple measurements really quickly. You do need to calibrate your meter, but it doesn't really take that long. And it's measured in milligrams per liter, which is perfect because that's how we measure percent. We can convert that into like dissolved oxygen, and it also measures temperature and percent DO, along with a bunch of other things too. And an additional video is on Canvas on how to step-by-step use this HOC meter. And later on, if you wanted to go over that, you can, in your own time, just walk through. It's not super hard to use, but I think, yeah, this is just one of the ways that we can measure dissolved oxygen. So in the video, it went over a couple different ways that the amount of oxygen in water can be affected. And some of those is the air-water gas transfer. So how is air or dissolved oxygen going into your water? And it depends on your temperature of your water, how warm it is, and turbulence, so the agitation within your water, how much your water is moving. Another is sediment oxygen uptake. So this is from decomposition. If you have leaf litter, if you have algae, whatever vegetation that's in your water, if there's a lot of it, if they grow too fast and there's not enough space or nutrients for them to continue growing at that rate, they start to decompose. And when they decompose, that process of decomposition takes up oxygen from water. Another factor that affect the amount of oxygen in your water is animal plant respiration. Like fish, they breathe in water. Plant respiration. Respiration also takes in oxygen and produces CO2. But photosynthesis from vegetation in your water also produces oxygen. So that's another side of having plants in your water body. So if we're going to go more specifically into the air-water gas transfer, there are a couple different factors that influence the transfer of oxygen. One is the temperature of your water. How warm is it? How cold is it? How elevated your water is. So how high up is your water body? Salinity, how salty your water is, and turbulence is their agitation for your water to get oxygen from the atmosphere. So if we're looking at your water body, and we're looking at how we can categorize how much water is in or how much oxygen is in your water. If it's undersaturated, that means that there's more oxygen in the atmosphere and it's going to diffuse into your water. If it's at saturation, so if it's at 100% saturation, it's equal parts oxygen in your water and in your atmosphere. And super saturated is when there's more oxygen in your water body and it's going to diffuse out into the atmosphere. And there's that arrow to show that direction for where your oxygen is going to go. So this chart is just an example to show dissolved oxygen and temperature. How does temperature change the amount of oxygen that can be in your water? So along the X horizontal axis, we have our temperature as our water is getting warmer. And on our Y vertical axis, we have our dissolved oxygen. So in milligrams per liter, how much oxygen is in our water at that point. So as our water is getting warmer, we can see that the amount of oxygen in our water is also going down. So the warmer our water, the less oxygen we have in our water. So that has effects on, say, like whatever fish that live in your water body, but also factories usually one way to cool down factories is that they use water from nearby waterways. And once they have superheated metal and they cool down that process, they discharge that warmer water into nearby waterways. And now that we see that there's less oxygen in warmer waters, what does that mean for fish that live in the water now that they have warmer water mixed in? So this is the basic relationship. We can also see that later on when we're making our Excel graphs, and we'll be charting this ourselves with data that in the past labs they've collected for us. So another factor that affects dissolved oxygen is photosynthesis. So from plants, the process of photosynthesis is shown in this equation at the bottom, where we have our carbon dioxide, we have our oxygen, we have our water and light, and it produces our sugars and our oxygen in the end. So photosynthesis for aquatic vegetation, it puts out oxygen, but on the opposite end, we have plant respiration, where it's just basically that same equation, but flipped, where we have our sugar, we have our oxygen, and in the process of decomposing, it'll produce CO2, carbon dioxide, water, and some heat energy. So talking more about the process of decomposition, we can relate that to algal blooms and eutrophication. So algal blooms happen when you have, say, you're near agriculture, or there's runoff from landfills, or pollution is washing into a lake. And so all these extra nutrients, some of them could be phosphorus, nitrogen, if they're from fertilizers. And fertilizers, they're meant to help plants grow really fast. So when all of these extra nutrients go into, say, your river, these, your vegetation in your river, it's going to grow really, really fast. But since that same amount of nutrients, it's not going to be constantly available. And there's also not enough space for them to continuously grow over time. When they do start dying, this process of decomposition is when the process of that takes out oxygen from the water and has an effect on the animals that live there. So that's one way that oxygen can be taken out. So we know that fish needs oxygen to live. So low dissolved oxygen levels lead to fish kills. The fish requirement of DO vary by species, but generally it's 5 to 6 milligrams per liter of DO for a fish habitat. And as you continuously get lower, the amounts of DO as it continuously gets lower, it has more effects on whether they continue to reproduce, feed, or exist. So now if we're going to look as an example in California, Lake Tahoe, it's well known for its water clarity, and it's one of those lakes because of its elevation. It doesn't freeze over during the winter. It's been, data's been recorded over time that for the past 40 years, lake clarity has been going down. So it's not as clear as it used to be, and they're trying to understand why. Well, a couple of different reasons if we're going to attribute it to why does water not look clear anymore? Well, there's something in it. What is it? Well, if you have erosion or construction or agriculture nearby and extra particles and extra soil gets into your water, it's going to create turbidity or cloudiness in your water. And so the Environmental Improvement Program for Lake Tahoe, they know that this is one of the reasons why. So they have started putting in more erosion control measures to reduce the amount of particles and reduce the amount of soil that are going into Lake Tahoe. So if we're thinking more about turbidity and cloudiness of water, turbidity is the optical quality of cloudiness or haziness of a fluid caused by small suspended particles similar to smoke in air. So turbidity is basically how cloudy your water is. It's measured in nephelometric turbidity units, NTUs, and it's nephelometry is the optical measurement of light reflected by particles suspended in a fluid. So if we're looking as an example of how turbidity is measured, we have our water sample in a vial. we have our light source that beams light into our water sample, and the amount of light refracted is recorded by our photodetector, and the final measurement is given to us in NTUs. So the higher our NTUs, the more cloudy our vial, our sample is. So if we're going from low turbidity to high turbidity, we're getting low turbidity is when our sample is super clear. And as we get higher and higher turbidity levels, that's when our sample is increasingly cloudier and cloudier. So say if we have deionized water or runoff. So the more, high NTUs, more suspended particles, low NTUs, less suspended particles, and the more clear it is. So we can measure turbidity using the HAWK 2100Q turbidimeter. It's another US EPA approved method, accurate, very portable, super easy to take into the field. Another one of those tools that you can just take out and bring anywhere. Multiple measurements can be done quickly. You do need to calibrate the meter, but it's not, it doesn't really take that long either. You just have your water sample of deionized water, you would put it in, hit calibrate, doesn't take too long, and then that would be your control for how, and you would have calibrated your meter that way. And it's measured in NTUs because this is turbidity. So if we're thinking more about soil types, grain size, and how that relates to turbidity, how does the grain size of your particle affect how cloudy your water is? So say if we're thinking about sand, which is a large grained, heavier particle, it's because it's heavy, it's going to settle out faster and it's not going to stay suspended as long. So as we go down, say to silt, medium grained, clay, fine grained, so a super lightweight particle is clay, super small particle size, and because it's so small and so lightweight, when it gets into water and it's shaken up, it stays suspended because it's so light and it doesn't settle out as fast. So then if you have clay in your water sample, that means it stays cloudier longer. So, and loam is a mixture of all other soil types. If we look at our, this picture on the side, we can see it just shows us the different particle sizes as we have gravel, which is really big, sand, silt, and clay. Clay is this super, super small grain, super small soil type. And the smaller it is, the lighter the smaller the size, the lighter it is, and it's gonna stay cloudier longer versus the bigger particles, which are heavier and will settle out faster. So now if we're thinking about construction and erosion and turbidity, along with changing the water color and turbidity levels of your water body, construction, if you don't have the right measures to keep all of the flying, like the fallout of your soil from getting into your waterways, it can erode and it can go into your water body. That's why usually if you see construction sites, they have chain link fences and like black mesh that are over the chain link fences to keep all this extra fallout of all this extra particles from going into your waterway. So again, turbidity is measured in NTUs, nephelometric turbidity units, and it means the degree to which light is scattered by particles suspended in a liquid. So how much light is reflected off of whatever your sample is. If we're looking at a construction site, this is some of the ways that stockpiled soil or soil can blow out or get into waterways. If it's unprotected in a stockpiled area, usually you would put a tarp over that so it wouldn't fly out everywhere. If there's vehicle track soil, so if vehicles and if you have soil that's exposed, then more soil is there for your vehicles to take it to other places. And that also has an effect on, say if you were like having like endangered species or endangered or invasive plants traveling too, but that's a different thing. And eroded soil from unprotected sites. So as they erode over time and get into, say, drains, and if there's not a filter in your drain, then that is also another way that it can get into your water body. So if we're looking back more specifically to the environmental improvement program for Lake Tahoe, they do have erosion control measures that are currently being implemented and maintained. And some of them are sediment traps. So say if we're looking at before, if we're thinking about how eroded soils can go into your drains, into your sewage drains, and get into your water bodies. Sediment traps are basically filters that they put underneath your local sewage drain or these drains on the side of the road. And it would filter and basically catch all of the particles or all of the extra leaf litter and things like that from getting into the water body. And it's manually changed out twice a year. So one of the ways that they control erosion or the amount of particles going into water is that way. Another is infiltration basins. Infiltration basins are basically a layering system underground. So they have it underground where each layer catches a different type of nutrient, different layers. It just filters out the water as your water goes through an infiltration basin. So it's all underground. And another would be natural barriers. So say if your water body is near, if you have sidewalks or roads near your water body, you would have natural barriers, which is basically just a strip of land with shrubbery, with vegetation. And as water is running off of your sidewalks or your roads, it would go into and filter through your root system of your vegetation before heading into your water body. So these are a couple of different ways that they have started to implement to control erosion and to help with the cloudiness of water in Lake Tahoe. So now we are going to be looking at data collected from past labs through making some Excel graphs. If we go back to the Canvas page, that's where we can find the Lab 6 Excel sheet. So if we go into Lab 6, so right underneath this first lab, so this is where you can find the questions that you'll be answering to, so the Lab 6 introduction. But if once it loads, it's the very last page with 5 questions. And you'll be answering this at the end, but this is where you can find your Lab 6 questions that you'll be answering on a separate doc and you'll be turning in. So if you continue to scroll down, we also see that there's additional, these are the 2 videos to look at how you measure DO and the turbidimeter. So using like the Hawk meters and all of that. So that's there for you to look at if you want, but this is the Microsoft Excel file that you would click on. And if it doesn't download by clicking on this link, you can also click on this black arrow on the side. And once you download that, it would look something like this. So once we're here, this is our Lab 6 water quality data collected by past labs before. And in our table 1, it's showing us temperature of water as warm water cools down, amount of oxygen at each level as it cools down. So what we're making today is just 2 charts. One is a scatter plot and another is a bar graph. For this first chart, we're making our scatter plot. So if we're trying to look at the relationship between temperature and oxygen, we can do that by making a scatter plot by first selecting the cells within these 2 rows, temperature and dissolved oxygen. And then we're gonna go under the tab, right next to the home tab, the insert tab. And in the middle of this toolbar, there's all these different options for graphs. We're going to click on the XY scatter button. And this very first option for scatter plot, we would just select that one. Did anybody want me to go over that again?
Yeah, could you do that one more time?
Yeah, sure. So once you would select these 2 rows, and once that's selected, right next to the home tab at the top, there's this insert tab. And near the middle where it says recommended charts, there's also this scatter, XY scatter button. And this very first option for scatter plot, you would just select that.
Insert.
Okay, so from here, we would just, this is our chart. We can format it to make it a little bit clearer. So we'll do that by adding in our x-axis title, our y-axis title, and changing our overall chart title here. So we can do that by, once your chart is selected, this chart design tab should pop up. If it's not there, just select your chart and then this tab should pop up. And if you click into this tab, all the way on the left side, we have add chart element. We click on that. This drop-down menu, we can hover over axes titles, and we're gonna want to add both primary horizontal and primary vertical, but we can first select our primary horizontal or x-axis. And we can change, once it pops up on our chart, we can change it to something more descriptive. So say right now this is temperature in degrees C. We're gonna wanna make sure that we have our units. So this is our temperature in degrees C. That's our horizontal title, horizontal axis title. And now we can add in our vertical axis title by going back under add chart element at the top left of our toolbar. If we hover over axes titles, again, the same place where we found our primary horizontal, right underneath that is our primary vertical, and we can add that to our chart. Once it pops up for that, we can just change this again to something more descriptive. So we're looking at dissolved oxygen levels. Dissolved oxygen, and it's in units of milligrams per liter. Again, we're gonna wanna make sure that our units are here. So now that we have our axes titles, we can change our, or at least like add to our chart title to make it more descriptive. So we have dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter in relation to temperature in degrees C. Something like this, it doesn't have to be exactly this chart title, but this is basically your first, the first graph that you need. And we can see that as temperature is getting warmer, the dissolved oxygen or the amount of oxygen in our water does go down. So that confirms what we already know about temperature and dissolved oxygen, the relationship between that. So once you're done making this graph, we can just move it down here, where this is our figure 1, which shows the relationship between temperature and dissolved oxygen. And we'll just make it a little bit smaller to fit in here. Now we can make our second chart. So it's going to be a bar graph, a column chart, and we're basically looking at in table 2, we have our site name. Say if we're looking at construction sites with different types of particles, different types of soils that can get into our water. We're looking at construction sites and saying before, after, and 2 hours after a storm. So after a storm would be, our storm would just be having our water sample, and we would shake it for 10 seconds or so to just mix everything together. And then 2 hours after the storm, we would wait 2 hours and then record our turbidity reading for that using the hop meter. We have our control, which is deionized water, and it's a very low NTU reading, which makes sense because it's very clear, very clean water. And then we have sand, our largest particle size, our heaviest, and clay all the way at the end, which is our smallest particle, our lightest one. And already we can see that the NTU readings, there's a big difference between our heaviest one, which is super low, which means that a lot of it's settled down and it's relatively clear, versus clay, where if you shake it up, they stay suspended and stays cloudy longer. But now if we wanted to look at it graphically, we can select these rows and columns. And once they're selected, we're gonna go back into the Insert tab at the top, right next to the Home tab. And in the middle of our toolbar, right above the scatter plot, we also have this column chart button. So when we select that, several options are given to us. We're just gonna want this very first 2D column clustered column option. So we can select that. And it would make our chart for us. Now we can make this a little bit bigger so we can see it a little bit clearer. And same thing as the other chart, we're just gonna want to add in our X and Y axes titles. So once your chart is selected and the chart design tab popped up, we're going to go all the way at the end of this toolbar under add chart elements. We'll select that. On this drop-down list, we'll hover over axes titles, and we'll have both this primary horizontal, primary vertical. We can select first our primary horizontal to make our x-axis. And when it pops up on our chart, we can change it to say site name, because in this example, where each of these different particle sizes or particles that we're looking at as it changes throughout the storm, they, this example is like if it's on a construction site. So we can just change it to site names. And once we've changed that, we can now add in our vertical axis title. So still our chart should be selected. If you're not in chart design, click back into this tab and then back to add chart elements. We'll select this button and then hover over axes titles. And we just added our primary horizontal. Now we'll just, we'll want to add our primary vertical, our Y axis. And on our Y, we're looking at our turbidity readings in NTU measured by our Hawk meter. So we can just change that to Hawk meter readings in NTU. And once we have our site names, our meter readings in NTU, our axes titles, we can just change our overall chart title here to describe what are we looking at. So it could be like turbidity readings in simulated storm event. And if we're looking at this graph, we can see that our control makes sense. There's no change, very small NTU readings because our control is our deionized water. And so it's very clear already. So there's not going to be a lot of cloudiness, but as we go up in particle sizes, our sand, quick to settle after a storm event. So again, very low readings. But as we go up to say clay, which is our lightest, our smallest particle size, and because it's so light, it's going to stay cloudy longer. It makes sense that immediately after our storm event, immediately after we shake up our water sample with clay in it, it's going to be super cloudy, so a very high NTU reading. And even 2 hours after the storm event, after we wait 2 hours for it to settle down, still very high NTU readings, still very cloudy water. So this is our second chart, and we can just move this down under and put it under figure 2. And along with changing the color and the quality of the water that we have, or the turbidity of the water, when we have like a lot of erosion or a lot of contaminants in the water, along with not looking so nice, it also can suffocate fish or plants that require oxygen, that need light to survive. And having a lot of like cloudiness or any contaminants in your water, it indicates like disease transfers or pathogens that are moving around in your water. So along with just changing the color of your water, there are other things that can be implied by as your turbidity, as your water gets cloudy. But this is basically the 2 charts that you have to make for your Excel sheet. Did anybody have any questions before we move on? So now if we go back to the PowerPoint. We just made our Excel graphs. And at the end of this, you would answer the Lab 6 assignment questions, the last page of the intro handout on Canvas that we just, I showed you before we made our Excel graphs. And you would turn in your Excel spreadsheet with scatter plot and the bar graph. So as a note, there are no labs next week because of the Easter holiday. We'll meet in 2 weeks in April, the week of April 5th. But let me also just briefly go over the assignment questions and go over that for you. So if we go back under Lab 6 Canvas page, these are the 5 questions that you would be answering. So the first one is to submit your graphs, your 2 graphs, your scatter plot of temperature versus DO, and your bar graph of turbidity. Yeah, second question, you're going to talk about what you, looking at that first scatter plot, excuse me, what is the relationship between DO and temperature? As the temperature of your water gets warmer, what does that mean for dissolved oxygen levels? And just briefly explain that. For question 3, you're talking about saturation, so the DO % value in your water. Question 4 is basically a case sample or a case example of power plants where they usually take water from nearby rivers or lakes to cool down their factories. And once it's cooled down, they discharge it, put that warmer water back into the water bodies. What does that mean if we know that warmer waters generally have less oxygen? And what does that mean for the aquatic life there if they need oxygen to survive? So you can talk about that. And for question 5, discuss the effect of erosion from soil erosion from construction sites. So you're referring to that bar graph, that column chart that we made with the different soil types. And what does that mean for turbidity and clarity with the different particle sizes? And just refer to your table when you're answering this question. And then there's part B where you're talking about what does it mean for the ecosystem with erosion control and as your water gets more turbid or cloudy. But these are the questions that you'll be answering for Lab 6. And you'll answer this on a separate Word doc and then turn it in along with your Excel sheet. And that is basically it for what you have to turn in for today. Did anybody have any questions or any issues with that? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all. I will see you in 2 weeks. Let me know if you have any questions along the way. But if not, I hope you have a good week. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, thank you.